prosecutor doesn't really have a lot of control of how the judge views the trial. So I obviously practice in state court. This is a federal court case, so take this all with a grain of salt. But a lot of times judges let attorneys try their case the way that they view it the best being tried, while only stepping in when plain error is occurring. So this judge is getting a lot more involved than what you would see in like a state court trial. It could be because he is truly just impatient, like he says, and wants it to get done and wants to move on. It could be because he sees actual plain error occurring on the part of the prosecutors by bringing up irrelevant details, or trying to get to something that isn't really relevant to Manafort's trial, for example, something that would actually implicate the president. But whether it's good strategy to irritate the judge, I don't think that's ever a good strategy. Obviously, the judge is always the decision maker, and the more you irritate the judge, the harder the rulings are going to be against you. Mm-hmm. The judge, theoretically, of course, still has to abide by the law, including the rules of criminal procedure and evidence, which would apply in any case. But I just don't think that the prosecutor has a ton of control over that. They're going to try the case that they are bringing forward with the witnesses that they have and the evidence that they have. They see that they need to get that evidence out to prove up the claims. They're going to have to do it. I actually, reading some of these articles about the back and forth between the judge and prosecutors, I had to go back and look at what Manafort was actually charged with, because I was like, to me, okay, why is the judge saying this is irrelevant when I understood it, that these were basically charges about lying to banks, evading taxes, disguising
Mm-hmm.
money transfers, that sort of thing. I think it is highly relevant that what travel costs were, for example, or what purchase costs were for certain things, when those are the actual charges. So,
So what about when the judge says, because they brought up a lot about, Paul Manafort's getting all of this money from oligarchs,
Yep.
and they keep bringing back like these mobsters, oligarchs within Ukraine, giving him a bunch of money,
Yep.
and Ellis was basically saying, okay, enough, you can't call them oligarchs, they're just people he did business with, like,
Right.
you refrain from calling them that. Do you feel like that's fair to the prosecution to kind of,
Well,
I guess, hamstring him maybe in that way? I know, I guess I get where Ellis is coming from, that he doesn't want to kind of,
Prejudice.
the prejudice against where he's getting the money,
Right.
even though he was getting money from oligarchs in the Ukraine.
right, and I think that's what the judge is most likely trying to avoid, is that sense of prejudice, making it out to be this deep, dark thing that it really isn't, where it's really a fairly normal business transaction. It happens to maybe possibly be an illegal business transaction, but the fact that he's doing business with someone from Ukraine is not that strange. So, bringing up terms like oligarch maybe makes it sound deeper and darker than it actually is. So my guess on that would be that he's trying to eliminate prejudice for the jury listening to it, thinking, "Who are these oligarchs? What does that mean?"
Mm-hmm.
Look it up.
Thinking of it as like, gangsters, or like these rich Ukrainians that can't be touched in their country and are dealing with people in control of things in our country. I would view that more as the judge trying to eliminate any prejudice than actually trying to tie up the prosecutor on any certain language. We eliminate a lot of terms from our normal talk in trial because it could be potentially prejudicial, such as using the word victim, or even sometimes identification of the defendant in court for the record, which we are required to do to make a clean record in case of an appeal. If the defendant happens to be Mexican or black or anything other than white, and he's the only one that's that in the room, it can potentially be prejudicial, right? Because they're saying,
Mm-hmm.
well, the guy who did it was black, the guy who did it was Mexican, the guy who did it was whatever.
So how do you get around that?
And then you say, okay, can you identify, do you see in the courtroom who that was? And then they say, yeah, it's the defendant, he's right here sitting in front of me. Defense attorneys object to it. It's not necessarily objectionable because it is something that we have to do for the record. A lot of the times defense attorneys will just point it out to the judge and put it in their record so that if it becomes an appeal issue later, that there's more prejudicial evidence coming in related to that, it's preserved as part of the appeal process.
Sure.
But so there is a lot of language that we try to avoid just to avoid any hint of prejudice. Because ultimately you want to try the cleanest case you can. Part of what I try to remember when reading a judge going this hard against a prosecutor or even a defense attorney is that the judge also has some interest in preserving this process, right? If there's a conviction or if there is not a conviction, we want this to stand and not be appealable. We want it to be the cleanest case there can be with no prosecutorial misconduct, nothing overly prejudicial to or against the defense. We want the best jury that we can have, which is why we do such a long voir dire process, to weed out any possible problem with like jury nullification or whatever. So keep in the back of your mind that part of the judge's goal is to preserve this process and make it the cleanest trial that he can, so that whatever happens, whether it's a conviction or an acquittal, it's clean and it can stand. That is part of the judge's job too.
Also, both of these, you know, so there's a lot of ego at play, and
Yes.
these guys know that the country's paying attention.
Everyone is watching.
It's their like chance to be in the limelight. So he's probably like trying out his one-liners beforehand, like making his clerks sit through just like tons of
Awful
horrible
jokes,
jokes,
yeah.
and like, or probably having his clerks like write them for him, maybe.
So you think
Yeah.
he's probably like looking in the mirror, being like
Oh, pumping
practicing his.
himself up, yeah,
yeah.
like wearing makeup just for like the person
for the
drawing
effect.
the like, yeah, what are they called?
The courtroom artist.
Courtroom artists. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's you know a good trial. It's like a show. Showering every day just because you think you're supposed to. That's stupid.
Yeah.
I shower once every 2 months, like clockwork. Works fine for me. Before we begin, please visit us on social media at Cold Call Wadcast. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Tell us what you think of our podcast, only if you like it, and or ask us a question. But it has to be a good question, not a lame question. There we go.
So yeah, I guess talking about the migrant crisis, for those who want a little bit of background, I mean, basically, the administration formed a no-tolerance policy at the southern border, which really which was a big change in terms of migrants coming over here. And so when he announced that, I think a lot of immigration attorneys saw the writing on the wall that's going to happen, and it kind of came true. They started prosecuting everyone who came across the southern border as a criminal. And in that regard, when you prosecute someone as a family as doing a criminal prosecution, they are then have the children taken away from them. So it's kind of, and I think the laws were kind of created to, if someone crosses over with with children as a family, but they have, a pound of cocaine on them, obviously you'd want to, try that, take away the children, put them in better homes, and then prosecute the person criminally, which I feel makes sense. But in this regards, they're just stripping families, whether it's just them seeking asylum, which is a lot of cases. If families were seeking asylum, they would cross the border, and traditionally they get they'd be detained as a family and kind of get their case gone through the immigration system. Whereas now it's being that the families are being stripped away. We've seen, the children being taken away, and now the government is moderately trying to reunite the families. I would say, from my personal opinion on this is, and I usually try to be a moderating voice on here, but I kind of find this as pretty evil to strip families away like that, to change the policies, and then treat the basically separate a family from each other, when most of these people were seeking asylum to get away from horrible conditions back in Central America. And so I kind of don't have any kind of moderating opinion on this other than I think it's pretty horrendous. And I guess I always grew up thinking that the Japanese internment was a huge blight, not only for like FDR's legacy, but also for the country, obviously in general. And but this is, it's kind of rivaling it, and it's pretty sad that in 2018 this is where we are. So just looking for what your guys' thoughts are on this issue.
I think it's definitely a really egregious act. I think Lacy can probably shed some more light on the immigration process that a lot of people may not know about, and the difficulties and challenges that families have. And I want to point out too, like the article that we read for this. I mean, this is taking data from 2009 to 2014. So this is very systemic. This has been going on. It doesn't make it right, but it's been an ongoing issue for quite some time now, and it's really sad to see how our nation is kind of turning for the worse.
Right, but the separation of families in the manner that they're doing right now is definitely different.
For
than
sure,
how
for
it's
sure.
done.
I mean,
Yeah.
we talk about these inadequate conditions that these children are, when they're taken away from their parents, are put into confinement, and not very. They're inadequate. They're I wouldn't say concentration camps, but they're by no means a.
Yeah, and
they're at hotels.
they've
There's
actually.
a lot of abuse allegations. I mean, they're like force feeding them like psychotropic drugs and.
Yeah, there's actually a judge just ruled that the Trump administration must stop giving psychotropic drugs to migrant children without consent of the families. Well, if the families are, if they've been stripped from their families, and or even deported in some cases, that's, it's hard to get consent, and so, these kids are just being, drugged, and the judge ruled that they can't.
So where do you draw the line? And I'm also just playing devil's advocate here. I mean, there are definitely children who may need these drugs and stuff. So where do you draw the line for kids who actually need these drugs versus, obviously, you don't line them up like cattle and force feed them their antibiotics. But I mean, some kids actually do need medicine. So where do you want to be able to make a distinction where these kids need some kind of medical attention if they're having,
Well, I don't deny that they need medical attention, but I think what this judge's ruling is they're giving them psychotropic drugs so that they aren't crying all the time, so they're not that they're not mentally kind of mentally going upset.
Because being in that
Without,
situation isn't
without
really,
parental consent.
Right, especially without parental
Right.
consent. So
they're the ones causing the mental breakdowns.
Yeah, I mean,
It's like that movie Holes.
Yeah.
I've never seen that
You
one.
never seen Holes?
I've never seen Holes. Maybe that'll.
So, and I think one of the things to take away from the story about giving psychotropic drugs to migrant children and what the district judge did in Los Angeles is that the ruling allows for it in cases of dire emergencies. So that's
Right,
currently where the
right.
line is drawn, right? But what the bigger story behind all of this is the Flores Agreement from the 1990s. How aware are you guys of the Flores Agreement? This was a settlement in a lawsuit against INS back in the 90s. Basically what was happening was before the Department of Homeland Security, we had the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services. That suit involved a child who had been taken from her parents and was being detained in a center that was like, it was either like an abandoned school or some abandoned facility where there weren't really any facilities for really anyone to live there. And she was being held until her immigration case was complete, which could take years. The father of the child sued, saying that there should be different standards for detaining children, that there should be a least restrictive alternative because the child involved in the case, Jenny Flores, had adult family members who were not immigrants who could take her in. At the time, INS prevented this because it had to be a parent or guardian. So the Flores settlement did two things. It required INS to look for a competent, available adult to put a child with as a least restrictive alternative, and it required INS to improve the conditions that children were being held in. Now, the Flores settlement was never meant to be permanent. This was never meant to last as long as it has. It was required to be implemented as a federal regulation. So the government could have gotten rid of the requirements of the Flores settlement, which still exists today, had it implemented a federal regulation, which Congress has the authority to do. Instead, what happened is in 2008,